Don't show up to the gala, you'll make us look bad. My brother didn't whisper. He didn't hesitate. He said it the way someone reads a memo they've already approved in their head, like the decision had been made long before the words reached me. You're too ordinary. Victoria's from old money. She's accomplished. You don't belong in our world. He smirked after that, the kind of expression people wear when they think they're being generous by telling you the truth. Like cutting me off was a kindness. Like he was saving me from embarrassment I was too naive to anticipate. I held the phone against my ear and let the silence stretch. Not because I was hurt, not because I was searching for a response. I was just noticing how easily the sentence had left his mouth, how rehearsed it felt, how little effort it took for him to reduce me to an inconvenience. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't remind him who I was becoming. I just said, okay. 5 days later, his fiancée walked into my office to negotiate a partnership deal with a company she didn't realize was mine. On the wall behind my desk hung a framed Forbes profile. The headline read, "The Self-Made Founder, Quietly Powering Wall Street's Infrastructure." My photograph. My name. Full page. She glanced at it the way people glance at art in waiting rooms, casual and indifferent, until her eyes landed on the face. Then she looked again. Then she froze. Because in that moment, she saw what he never did. The woman he dismissed wasn't just ordinary. She was the one running the system his world quietly depended on. And he had no idea how close he was to losing the only leverage he thought he had. That phone call wasn't the first time my brother had made a decision about me without consulting me. It wasn't even the cruelest. But it was the clearest. For the first time, he didn't bother to dress it up as concern or timing or logistics. He just said what he meant. And that honesty, as cold as it was, gave me something I hadn't expected: clarity. The New Year Gala was never really about the event itself. It was a symbol, one of many carefully curated rooms my brother moved through with the confidence of someone who had learned early that success didn't need to be exceptional, it just needed to be legible. He knew how to stand in photographs, so he looked central even when he wasn't. He knew how to tell stories that sounded complete without ever being specific. His career followed the same principle: solid credentials, the right introductions, a trajectory that made sense on paper. Nothing about him invited questions. That was the real achievement. People didn't need to understand him deeply. They just needed to recognize him quickly. To him, I was a problem not because I failed, but because I didn't translate. I wasn't a liability. I was inefficient. In his world, everyone had a function, and mine didn't enhance the story he was trying to tell. I didn't make him look more impressive by standing next to him. I didn't add context that elevated his position. I existed adjacent to him without being useful, which in his mind was worse than being openly unsuccessful. Failure could be framed as struggle. I offered no such narrative. I was simply there, and that unsettled him more than he ever admitted. Our family didn't challenge his decision. They never do. Resistance would have required them to examine a structure they benefited from, and that kind of examination is exhausting. It's easier to treat moments like this as minor inconveniences, to smooth them over with familiar phrases. It's just one night. You understand how these things are. Don't make it bigger than it needs to be. No one asked how it felt to be excluded. They weren't being cruel. They were being efficient. Harmony mattered more than accuracy. The absence of conflict was mistaken for fairness, and my silence made it possible to maintain that illusion. I've been told more than once that I'm good at letting things go. That's the version of the story that's easiest to repeat. What people don't see is how much effort it takes to decide when not to speak. I used to explain everything. I believed clarity was a form of protection, that if I articulated myself carefully enough, misunderstandings would dissolve. Over time, I noticed the pattern. The more precisely I spoke, the more my words were treated as unnecessary complications. The problem was never that I couldn't be understood. It was that understanding me didn't serve anyone else's comfort. Silence became less painful than correction. It also became more strategic. When my brother dismissed me, he assumed he was ending a conversation. He didn't realize he was confirming one. The okay landed this way he expected it to, neat and compliant, a punctuation mark that allowed him to move on without discomfort. What he didn't account for was how final that word could be when spoken by someone who had already finished negotiating internally. I didn't agree with him. I was stepping out of the frame he controlled. The days that followed were unremarkable on the surface. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings that required focus rather than performance. There was an email confirming a meeting the following week, flagged as high priority. My assistant asked me to confirm availability. I did. A name appeared on the agenda that I recognized without reacting to. Recognition didn't require acknowledgement. I'd learned that too. There are moments when reacting gives something weight it doesn't deserve, when neutrality is the clearest signal you can send. That evening alone in my apartment, I didn't feel the emptiness people expect in scenes like this. There was no dramatic reckoning, no surge of anger demanding release, just a steady awareness that two narratives were finally diverging instead of pretending to run parallel. My family would attend the gala without me filling the space seamlessly, telling the story they'd rehearsed so well. I wouldn't miss being there. That much was obvious. What they didn't see was how little their version of events intersected with the systems that occupied my days. The ones that didn't require my presence to be decorative, only decisive. I've spent years moving through rooms where my value wasn't discussed because it was assumed where questions were framed around outcomes rather than optics. Those rooms don't look impressive from the outside. They don't photograph well. But they function quietly and relentlessly because people inside them understand the cost of interruption. My brother never needed to understand that world to benefit from it. He only needed it to work, and it did, with or without his approval. When I think back to that call now, what stays with me isn't the insult itself, but the confidence with which it was delivered. He truly believed he was doing me a favor, sparing me an environment where I wouldn't belong. In that belief was the clearest expression of how he saw me, not as someone capable of choosing her own rooms, but as someone who needed to be placed. I didn't correct him. Corrections imply a shared framework, a mutual investment in accuracy. We didn't have that. What we had was a long-standing agreement that I wouldn't disrupt the story unless it benefited everyone involved. Saying okay honored that agreement while quietly voiding it. I wasn't withdrawing in defeat. I was declining participation. There are worlds that continue just fine without you. There are others that only appear stable until you step away. I knew which one I was leaving and which one I was staying in. The gala would proceed. The photographs would be taken, the introductions made. Somewhere else, decisions would be signed, systems would continue to run, and no one would pause to wonder whether I belonged. That was the difference, and it was enough. The morning after the call, my phone lit up with a familiar rhythm. Short messages stacked neatly in the family group chat, practical and efficient, as if nothing had happened. Times were being confirmed, rides coordinated, keys accounted for. There were no questions, no acknowledgments, no stray sentences that might invite emotion. I read each message without replying, watching the thread move forward without needing me to push it along. My mother sent a photo of the dress she planned to wear to the gala. Emerald green, floor-length, the kind of dress that photographs well from every angle. My father responded with a heart emoji. Daniel confirmed the car service would arrive at 7. Victoria's name appeared twice, mentioned casually with the easy familiarity of someone who had already been absorbed into the family's inner circle. My name appeared nowhere. The omission wasn't aggressive. It didn't need to be. By continuing as if the decision had always existed, the family spared itself the work of revisiting it. Exclusion didn't have to be restated. It had been logged, accepted, and filed. I've learned that families don't assign roles once. They refine them over time, adjusting the edges until everyone fits into the space they've been given. The process is so gradual that by the time you notice it, the shape has already hardened around you. I can trace the pattern back further than I'd like to admit. When we were children, Daniel was the one who got called on first. At dinner tables, at family gatherings, at school events where parents clustered together, comparing notes about their kids. His name came with an exclamation point attached. Daniel made the honor roll. Daniel scored the winning goal. Daniel got into his first choice college. My name came with a period, a quiet punctuation mark that didn't invite follow-up questions. I don't remember when I first noticed the difference. It wasn't a single moment, but an accumulation of small ones. The way conversations would pause when Daniel entered a room and continue unchanged when I did. The way photographs seemed to arrange themselves around him naturally, while I was always positioned at the edge, slightly out of focus. The way my achievements were acknowledged with nods, while his were celebrated with dinners. In rooms where outsiders were present, friends, colleagues, distant relatives, my brother was introduced with a practiced cadence. His name came first, followed by a brief, flattering summary that made sense immediately. Daniel works in finance. He's doing very well. Just got promoted again. People nodded, smiled, oriented themselves around him like planets finding their orbit. When my turn arrived, it often came later, softer framed as an addendum. Sometimes it was a quick explanation rather than an introduction, a phrase that folded me into him instead of placing me beside him. "That's his sister," someone would say, as if that were sufficient context. No one meant harm. The effect didn't require intent. Introductions establish who represents the group, who can speak for it, who belongs to the story others are invited to understand. Being explained instead of introduced was subtle, but it carried a consequence. I wasn't meant to stand alone. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner maybe 8 years ago. I had just closed my first major contracted deal that had taken months to negotiate that would become the foundation of everything I built afterward. I was proud in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, the kind of pride that makes you want to share. I waited for a pause in the conversation. When it came, I started to mention the news. I got about half a sentence out before my mother interrupted. "Daniel, tell everyone about your trip to London," she said, her voice bright with interest. "The hotel you stayed at sounded amazing." And just like that, my contract dissolved into the air, replaced by a story about room service and theater tickets and a client dinner at some restaurant I'd never heard of. I didn't try again after that, not because I was devastated, but because I understood something I hadn't before. The interruption wasn't personal, it was procedural. There was an order for how information flowed in our family, and I had tried to jump the queue. Once at a small gathering where the details mattered more than the volume, I corrected a point my family had misstated. My father had been telling a colleague about a news story getting the central facts wrong in a way that would have embarrassed him if anyone who knew better had been listening. I offered a clarification accurate and brief, the kind that keeps conversations from drifting into error. I thought I was helping. No one argued with me. No one thanked me either. The room simply lost momentum like a wheel encountering unexpected resistance. My father's expression flickered just for a moment, a flash of something that might have been embarrassment or irritation, before resettling into something neutral. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. The colleague glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite read. My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Daniel took a sudden interest in his drink. After that, I noticed I wasn't asked for input again. The correction hadn't been wrong. It had been uninvited. My contribution had changed the temperature, and that was enough to mark it as disruptive. From then on, information flowed around me rather than through me. The message was clear without being spoken. Help only helps when it arrives on cue. My brother didn't dislike me for this. That was the most confusing part for people who wanted a villain in this story. He didn't resent me. He didn't compete with me. In his mental architecture, each person had a function, and efficiency depended on clarity. I wasn't a failure in his eyes. I was undefined. I didn't add shine to the image he carried into rooms. I didn't amplify his credibility by association. In a system that prized legibility, ambiguity was a flaw. So I was set aside, not out of cruelty, but out of preference. He gravitated toward people who made his story easier to tell, and I complicated it by existing without enhancing it. The family followed his lead not because they were weak, but because stability has a gravitational pull. He was the one others deferred to, the one who navigated public spaces with confidence. Challenging his decisions would have required effort and risk, and no one felt compelled to invest either. It was easier to keep things uncomplicated, to smooth edges, to repeat phrases that closed conversations before they opened. It's not worth the stress. Let's not turn this into something. You know how he is. And those sentences carried authority because they promised peace. What they concealed was the price of that peace. Someone had to absorb the discomfort so the rest could avoid it. That someone was always me. Over time, the pattern became legible. Those who helped the family look coherent were kept close. Those who didn't weren't confronted. They were simply ignored. It was a quiet sorting mechanism, efficient and humane on the surface. No accusations, no punishments, just a gradual reduction of relevance. When my brother spoke for the family, he did so with confidence because no one interrupted him. When he made decisions, they stood because no one wanted to complicate the narrative. The absence of dissent wasn't proof of agreement. It was proof of prioritization. Once you see that mechanism, certain moments reframe themselves. Invitations arrive already filtered. Decisions appear fully formed. Questions are asked only of those whose answers are expected to align. I wasn't angry when I recognized it. I was relieved. Anger assumes a personal slight. This was structural. I wasn't being singled out. I was being categorized. The realization shifted something important. If the rule was consistent, then my compliance or resistance wouldn't change it. What would change was my relationship to it. Silence wasn't something I was born into. I learned it the way you learn anything that keeps you functional, through repetition, through correction, through noticing what costs too much. There was a version of me that explained everything, that filled gaps before anyone asked, that believed misunderstandings were accidents waiting to be fixed. I talked because I thought clarity was kindness. I remember being 23, fresh out of graduate school, excited about a job offer I'd received. I spent an entire dinner explaining the role, the company, the potential. I talked about the technology I'd be working with, the problems I'd be solving, the team I'd be joining. When I finished, my mother smiled politely and asked Daniel if he wanted more potatoes. That was the first time I noticed the pattern. Each time I tried to share something, the response was the same regardless of the words I chose. I was told I was overthinking, that I was making things heavier than they needed to be, that not every thought had to be voiced. After enough cycles, the pattern became undeniable. The feedback never adjusted to the content. It only reacted to the act of speaking itself. Once you realize the response is fixed, the equation changes. Words stop being tools and start being expenses. I didn't stop talking because I was tired. I stopped because the return on investment was consistently negative. The first time I chose not to share something important wasn't dramatic. There was no internal monologue about self-protection or strategy. I reached a personal milestone quiet, unannounced, the kind that feels solid even before anyone validates it. I had just signed my first major client, a bank that handled transactions for half the hedge funds on the East Coast, the kind of contract that changes a company's trajectory. I had worked on the deal for 6 months, navigating legal complications and technical requirements and the particular politics of institutional finance. At dinner that night, conversation drifted past it without pause. My parents asked Daniel about his weekend plans. They discussed a neighbor's renovation project. They debated whether to repaint the living room. No one asked what I'd been working on. No one left space for an answer I wasn't prompted to give. I noticed the moment where I could have inserted myself, where I could have redirected the focus with a sentence or two. I had done it before, tried to carve out a small space for my own news. Instead, I didn't. I let the topic pass. Nothing changed. No one leaned back and asked what they'd missed. The evening continued seamlessly, and that was the point. Recognition doesn't appear spontaneously. It arrives only when the environment is prepared to receive it. That night taught me something practical. Silence doesn't create absence if no one is looking for presence. As I spoke, less certain things began to happen around me. Comparisons slowed down, then stopped. My words weren't being edited mid-sentence anymore. Conversations didn't stall when I entered them. The atmosphere lightened in ways that were measurable, not emotional. People relaxed when I didn't require acknowledgement. The absence of explanation made interactions easier for everyone else. I wasn't offended by that realization. I logged in. Silence reduces friction. Silence allowed me to exist without being managed. It was a conditional peace, but it was peace all the same. The benefit wasn't invisibility. It was autonomy. When you're not explaining yourself, you're not available for correction. There's a difference between being discreet and being dishonest, and I was careful to stay on one side of it. I didn't fabricate stories or allow false statements to stand if they crossed into deception. I didn't deny facts or create alternate versions of myself. What I stopped doing was promotion. I stopped adjusting other people's narratives to include me accurately. I let their assumptions sit where they landed. This wasn't fear. It was an observation. I wanted to see how I was treated when my value wasn't displayed, when I wasn't performing relevance. The results were consistent enough to be useful. When I didn't offer context, people supplied their own, and those contexts revealed more about them than any explanation I could have given. The questions my family asked were carefully calibrated to stay within a safe range. "How are you doing? Are you tired? Is everything okay?" They never crossed into territory that would require them to update their understanding of me. No one asked what I was building or where I was headed. No one asked about my clients or my company or the systems I was designing. Curiosity stopped at the edge of comfort. It wasn't cruelty, it was conservation. Asking deeper questions would have required effort adjustment, maybe even acknowledgement that their mental model was outdated. The absence of those questions wasn't neglect, it was maintenance. They were preserving a version of the story that worked for them. Over time, okay became a skill rather than a reflex. It was efficient. It closed conversations cleanly. It prevented follow-ups that would need managing later. People grow accustomed to agreement. They stop preparing for resistance. They begin to assume consent where none has been explicitly given. The gala wasn't the first time I said it. It was simply the loudest. By then, okay had become part of the furniture. It was expected. What no one anticipated was what happened when agreement no longer functioned as access. Silence, once a courtesy, became a boundary. I started paying attention to calendars instead of conversations. My week was divided into two categories: obligations that included me by default and events that didn't require my presence to proceed. Family gatherings fell neatly into the second column. Work commitments, still unnamed, still unremarkable to anyone else, occupied the first. I didn't feel pulled between them. I felt aligned. When you stop explaining yourself, your life becomes organized differently. You move according to decisions rather than reactions. Looking ahead, the contrast sharpened. One date marked for a family event where my absence was assumed. Another reserved for a meeting whose details mattered even if no one connected it to me yet. I didn't feel resentment toward either. I felt curious. If I truly were as ordinary as they believed, my absence shouldn't have mattered. The system would continue unchanged, and no one would notice the gap. If I truly only existed when spoken about, then disappearing should erase me completely. If not, something else would fill the space I left behind. That thought stayed with me, not as a challenge, but as a hypothesis. I didn't need to announce it or defend it. I only needed to watch what happened when I stepped out of frame. Sometimes the shape of a system reveals itself, not when you push against it, but when you let it run without you. Silence isn't empty. It's a test. The last week of the year arrived without ceremony, and my calendar filled itself before I had time to think about what it meant. Meetings, confirmed calls, stacked back-to-back deadlines compressed by the artificial urgency that always comes with December. There were no empty blocks waiting for someone to claim them. No vague placeholders labeled family or holiday. Everything had a purpose, a time, a dependency. Messages from home appeared in contrast. Short notes, informational, written as if copied from a checklist. Times, locations, reminders. No questions attached, no invitations disguised as courtesy. I wasn't asked where I'd be or whether I'd make it. My absence had already been accounted for, logged as a constant rather than an exception. In my family's world, preparation meant alignment. Who would arrive together, who would be introduced first, who would stand where photographs were taken. These decisions weren't debated. They were refined. My brother coordinated the details with the confidence of someone used to narrating outcomes. He spoke about appearances the way other people speak about logistics, as something that could be optimized if handled correctly. Victoria's name surfaced often, always with a specific weight. She wasn't discussed as a person so much as a confirmation, a signal that the family belonged in certain rooms. When my name came up at all, it was filtered through neutral language, scheduling conflicts, different priorities, not the right setting, nothing inaccurate, nothing personal. The story was edited until it flowed without interruption, and I wasn't required for the final cut. At the same time, my own week unfolded through a series of decisions that didn't wait for consensus. A meeting was pushed forward, which meant another had to be rearranged. Documents arrived needing signatures before offices closed for the year. Emails came marked urgent, not because they were dramatic, but because there was no one else to route them to. No one asked if I was free. No one checked whether it conflicted with something else. They assumed I'd handle it, and they were right. The work didn't acknowledge holidays unless forced to, and neither did I. The system functioned because it was designed to depend on specific responses, and those responses came from me without delay. The contrast was precise rather than emotional. In one world, value was measured by presence, by how well someone fit into an image that would be consumed by others. In the other, value was measured by outcome. Decisions mattered only if they were held under pressure. Responsibility attached itself to whoever could carry it without explanation. I didn't think one system was better than the other. I only noticed that they didn't intersect. The language used in one meant nothing in the other. No amount of charm or lineage could replace a missing signature. No carefully curated introduction could solve a problem that required action instead of visibility. Midweek, my assistant confirmed the agenda for the following week. The meeting was flagged as high priority, the kind that altered timelines if it went well and stalled them if it didn't. Names populated the list, some familiar, others less so. One stood out long enough for me to register it, then pass over it without comment. I didn't ask for clarification. I didn't need to. The meeting existed whether I anticipated it or not, and my role in it was unchanged by who else would be present. Logistics have a way of arranging encounters without consulting personal history. The night of the gala arrived like any other evening on my schedule. I didn't check for updates or scan social media for images. I didn't wait for messages that might or might not come. The event took place somewhere else, following rules that had nothing to do with me. My family appeared exactly as planned, each person fulfilling their assigned role. I wasn't missing anything I was meant to attend. The absence didn't create a gap in my day, and that realization was quietly definitive. For the first time, not showing up didn't feel like a loss. It felt like alignment. When the day ended, I closed my laptop and looked ahead. The calendar displayed the coming week in clean blocks of color, one meeting marked with a priority tag that stood out against the rest. Everything else had resolved into its place. The family believed I had been excluded from a world that mattered. What they couldn't see was that I had moved deeper into one that didn't require their permission, a system that wouldn't pause if they failed to recognize it. Victoria existed in my family long before she ever existed to me. Her name arrived pre-packaged, delivered in clean phrases that sounded rehearsed, even when spoken casually. She was exactly right, from the right background, the kind of woman who knows how things work. Daniel talked about her the way people talk about credentials, not memories. Each mention came with a quiet expectation that the rest of us would understand what she represented without asking questions. My parents nodded along, absorbing the outline of a person they hadn't met enough to be curious about. No one asked what she liked, what she avoided, what made her hesitate. The admiration wasn't directed at her so much as at the feeling she gave the family, the sense that something had finally aligned. Listening to it, I realized something I hadn't before. Victoria hadn't been allowed to be a person yet. She had been turned into a profile the same way I had once been reduced to an inconvenience. Different ends of the same mechanism. Daniel was good at telling stories that sounded complete without ever becoming specific. When he spoke about Victoria, he chose details that traveled well. Her family's history, her connections, the way she navigated social situations without friction. He never mentioned a private moment or a disagreement that revealed character. There were no anecdotes that couldn't be repeated at a dinner table. Everything he said could be displayed. I noticed how carefully he avoided anything that might require interpretation. When he asked me before the gala not to complicate things, his tone suggested concern, but the structure of the sentence carried instruction. It wasn't about my comfort. It was about preserving the narrative he had already sold. He didn't need to criticize me to do it. He simply told a version of the story where I wasn't necessary, where my presence added noise instead of value. What Daniel never mentioned, what he probably didn't fully understand himself, was what I actually did. He knew I worked in technology. He knew it involved finance somehow. Beyond that, his curiosity had never extended far enough to ask real questions, and I had stopped volunteering answers years ago. The company I built wasn't glamorous in the way he understood glamour. We didn't have a sleek office in Manhattan with a view of Central Park. We didn't throw launch parties or court celebrity investors. What we had was infrastructure, the kind that runs so quietly beneath the surface that most people never think about it until it stops working. Our platform processed payment verifications for some of the largest financial institutions on the East Coast. When a hedge fund executed a trade, our system confirmed the counterparty's liquidity in milliseconds. When a bank transferred funds internationally, our software flagged compliance risks before the money left the account. When trading firms needed real-time settlement data, they came to us because we were faster, more reliable, and more secure than anyone else in the market. We weren't famous, we were essential. And in the world I operated in, essentially paid better than famous ever could. Victoria's company, a mid-sized private equity firm with ambitions of expanding into fintech acquisitions, had approached us 3 months earlier. They wanted access to our verification protocols for a portfolio company they were restructuring. The deal wasn't enormous by our standards, but it was strategic. It would give us a foothold in a sector we'd been watching, and it would give them technology they couldn't build themselves without years of development and regulatory headaches. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria's firm needed what I had built. And Daniel, who had dismissed me as too ordinary to attend a party, had no idea that his fiancée's professional future was about to intersect with the sister he'd erased from relevance. In Victoria's own world, competence wasn't an accessory. She moved quickly, made decisions without hesitation, and trusted systems that had worked for her before. Her calendar was dense, her calls efficient. She lived inside pipelines built to deliver vetted information, and she believed in them because they had rarely failed her. Introductions came filtered summaries prepared in advance. She evaluated opportunities the same way every time, checking for stability, legal exposure, scalability. Family details about Daniel were peripheral, something to be acknowledged, but not interrogated. She assumed what she had been told was sufficient, because it usually was. I had done my own research on her the way I researched anyone before a significant meeting. Victoria had built her career on precision. She started in investment banking, moved to private equity before 30, and had a reputation for identifying undervalued assets that others overlooked. Her track record was impressive, not because she took big swings, but because she rarely missed. What interested me most was what I found between the lines. She had left her previous firm abruptly 2 years ago, taking a pay cut to join her current company as a partner. The public story was about seeking new challenges, but I noticed she left shortly after that firm's founding partner was quietly pushed out following an ethics investigation. She had seen something she didn't want to be associated with, and she had walked away cleanly. That told me more about her than any deal sheet could. Victoria valued her reputation. She protected it carefully, which meant the moment she realized Daniel had misled her about his own family, the fracture would run deeper than embarrassment. It would feel like a breach of the very foundation she had built her professional life on. People like Victoria are dangerous to underestimate, not because they're ruthless, but because they're precise. The flaw in precision is overconfidence in the input. The story she received about me wasn't hostile. That was the most effective part of it. I was described as ordinary, disengaged someone who didn't participate in events that mattered. There was no insult to defend against, no lie, obvious enough to challenge. Daniel had been careful, I realized. He never said I was a failure. He never claimed I was estranged or difficult. He simply made me small. A background figure. someone who existed on the periphery of a family that had more interesting things to discuss. When Victoria's team prepared their briefing materials for this meeting, they would have researched our company thoroughly. They would have pulled articles, reviewed our client list, studied our leadership team. My name would have appeared as founder and CEO. My photograph would have been included in the executive summary. But here's what I understood about how information travels in her world. Context determines what people see. Victoria was coming to this meeting thinking about deal terms and integration timelines. She was thinking about her portfolio company and how our technology could solve their verification problems. She wasn't thinking about her fiancé's family, because why would she? Those were separate compartments, and she had no reason to connect them. My last name wasn't the same as Daniel's. I had kept our mother's maiden name when I started the company, partly for privacy, partly because I had always felt more connected to that side of the family. It was a small difference, but it was enough. Victoria's team would have seen my name without recognition. Just another founder, just another meeting. Daniel didn't need to fabricate anything. He just removed me from the map, and I had inadvertently helped by existing under a different name entirely. Listening to the echoes of that narrative, I recognized the danger. Silence when directed becomes control. You don't have to destroy someone's reputation if you can convince others they don't need one. The partnership meeting was scheduled with the kind of finality that left no room for adjustment. Victoria's team sent over the documents first precise and thorough. NDA's agendas, lists of attendees. Everything arrived on time, everything aligned. I reviewed the attendee list when it came through. Victoria Hale, 2 associates, 1 legal counsel, standard configuration for a deal of this size. Nothing unusual except for the name I had been hearing at family dinners for the past 18 months. Our responses were brief, professional, stripped of unnecessary warmth. I could tell from the follow-up emails that she noticed the efficiency. It signaled seriousness, a lack of interest in ceremony. It earned her respect before the meeting ever took place. She didn't know who she would be sitting across from, but she knew the operation on the other side was competent. That mattered more to her than familiarity. In rooms where reputation often substituted for substance, she was about to enter one where the opposite was true. On my end, preparation followed a familiar pattern. Documents reviewed, contingencies outlined, boundaries clarified. I didn't adjust my approach because of who might attend. The meeting required the same discipline regardless of the names on the list. My team had prepared the standard presentation: market analysis, competitive positioning, integration roadmap, pricing structure. I had reviewed it twice, made minor adjustments, and approved the final version. If anyone noticed that I was more thorough than usual, they didn't mention it. The truth was, I didn't know how I felt about what was coming. There was no plan here, no orchestrated revenge. The meeting had been scheduled months before Daniel made that phone call. The timing was a coincidence, life arranging its own confrontations without asking permission. Meanwhile, Victoria prepared under a different assumption. She believed she understood the landscape already. Daniel's story had done its work. She thought she knew which relationships were central, which ones peripheral. She trusted the classification because it fit the system she'd always operated in. Neither of us anticipated that the family narrative would walk straight into a professional space and collapse under its own omissions. The morning of her arrival, my assistant's message was concise. They had arrived. Conference room B. Ready when you are. No embellishment, no warning. I didn't feel a surge of anticipation or dread. The moment wasn't about confrontation. It was about placement. I looked at the message for a long moment before standing up. Through my office window, I could see the city stretching out below morning light, catching the glass towers of the financial district. Somewhere in those buildings, money was moving through systems I had helped design. Decisions were being made based on data my platform verified. The world I had built was functioning exactly as intended, invisible and essential. Victoria was about to step into a room where names didn't precede actions, where authority wasn't introduced. It was assumed by whoever the process waited for. She didn't know that yet. She believed she was entering a familiar kind of meeting, one where context would smooth over gaps. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. I gathered my notes, checked my reflection briefly in the dark screen of my monitor, and walked toward the conference room. My heels were steady on the floor. My hands weren't shaking. Whatever happened next, I would handle it the way I handled everything else, with clarity, with precision, without asking anyone's permission. There are truths that don't need to be announced. They only need the right setting to surface. I arrived at the office the way I always did, early enough that the day still felt neutral before anyone had the chance to attach meaning to it. The agenda was already set, the documents stacked in the order I preferred, notes marked where decisions would likely stall if they weren't guided firmly. The meeting had been flagged as priority because of scope and liability, not because of who was attending. I didn't think about family or gala invitations or anything that lived outside the walls of work. Nothing in my preparation required that context. The morning moved forward on schedule, and that was enough. By the time the conference room door opened, the system was already in motion. Victoria entered with her team-measured alert, carrying herself the way people do when they expect to be oriented before they begin. She paused for the briefest moment, the kind that usually precedes an introduction, a signal from someone else that establishes the order of things. It didn't come. No one rose to announce her arrival. No one adjusted their posture to accommodate her presence. Seats were taken because it was time to sit, not because someone important had arrived. The meeting started when the clock reached its mark, not when recognition was granted. I watched her recalibrate in real time, the subtle shift of attention that happens when a familiar cue is missing. When my name appeared on the screen and I stepped into the role the room was already waiting for, the recognition happened without ceremony. There was no reaction loud enough to name just a pause that didn't belong to anyone in particular. Victoria looked from the name to the person and back again, a calculation forming behind her eyes. I saw the exact moment it landed. Her gaze moved from the presentation slide, where my name was displayed, to my face, then back to the slide. A small crease appeared between her eyebrows. Not confusion exactly. Recognition arriving in the wrong context, like hearing a familiar song in an unexpected language. She knew my face. She must have seen photographs at Daniel's apartment on our parents' mantel during holiday visits. The ordinary sister, the one who didn't attend important events, the one who worked in technology somewhere doing something that didn't warrant detailed explanation. And now that face was attached to a name on a screen that read Founder and CEO. That face was sitting at the head of a conference table in an office that processed more financial data in a day than most banks handled in a week. I didn't acknowledge her pause. I didn't need to. The structure held. Introductions were procedural, minimal, designed to establish function rather than status. Whatever story she had brought with her wasn't part of the agenda. I opened the meeting the way I always did, by outlining the objective and the constraints without softening either. There was no preamble, no attempt to set a tone beyond clarity. Decisions were framed in terms of consequence, timelines aligned to reality rather than preference. The integration timeline your team proposed is aggressive, I said, advancing to the next slide. Our compliance protocols require a minimum of 60 days for new client onboarding. That's not negotiable. It's regulatory. Victoria's associate started to respond, but she held up a hand, slightly stopping him. Her eyes hadn't fully left my face since the introduction. "Understood," she said. Her voice was steady, professional, but I caught the slight delay before she spoke, the half second, where she was still processing something that had nothing to do with compliance timelines. Questions came in when they were relevant, and answers were given without embellishment. Each point resolved itself or flagged where it would require follow-up. The room adjusted to the rhythm because it had to. Authority wasn't asserted. It was assumed by whoever the process waited for, and it waited for me. Victoria asked her first question with the confidence of someone accustomed to leading discussions. "What's your current capacity for handling increased verification volume?" Our portfolio company processes roughly 50,000 transactions daily. "We handle 3 million daily across all clients," I said. 50,000 is well within our scaling parameters. She adjusted when the answer redirected the premise. Her next question arrived slower, more careful, stripped of assumptions. "And the proprietary algorithm your team developed for fraud detection. The documentation mentions machine learning components. How frequently is the model retrained?" I noticed the shift not as a victory but as a fact. She was no longer asking questions to establish her position. She was asking because she genuinely needed to understand what she was looking at. The company, the technology, me. She wasn't flustered. She was precise. Precision is what people resort to when narrative fails them. I didn't look at her longer than necessary. I didn't change my tone or pace. The meeting didn't revolve around recognition. It revolved around resolution, and that left little room for anything else. At some point, while a slide remained on the screen longer than planned, her attention drifted to the wall behind me. The Forbes profile was framed plainly positioned where it always had been, not as a statement, but as a record. The self-made founder, quietly powering Wall Street's infrastructure. The photograph showed me at my desk, looking directly at the camera, no smile, no performance. Just presence. I didn't see her reaction directly, only the stillness that followed, the way her focus fractured before settling again. Her hand, which had been resting on her notepad, went still. She didn't write anything for almost a full minute. I knew what she was doing. She was reordering. Every piece of information Daniel had given her about his family was being re-examined against this new data point. The ordinary sister, the one who didn't belong in their world, the one who would make them look bad at a gala. That sister had a Forbes profile on her wall. That sister was the person Victoria's firm had spent 3 months pursuing for a partnership. That sister controlled technology that Victoria's portfolio company desperately needed. No one commented. No one needed to. The information existed independently of the room's acknowledgement. It didn't require interpretation or defense. It simply sat there undoing whatever version of events she had arrived with. The meeting continued. It had to. Agreements were refined, risks outlined, next steps assigned. The work didn't pause for internal reckoning. Victoria's questions changed again this time, becoming narrower, anchored to verification rather than persuasion. "The contract terms your legal team sent over," she said, and I noticed her voice had shifted. Still professional, but something underneath had changed. A new carefulness. "The exclusivity clause in Section 4, is there flexibility there?" "Limited," I said. "We can discuss specific carve-outs, but the core exclusivity protects both parties." She nodded, wrote something down. Didn't push further. She was recalculating, and I respected that. I didn't offer context. I didn't correct any imagined misunderstandings. The process didn't require my intervention on that front. Part of me wondered if she would say something, if she would wait until her team left and then ask the question that had to be forming in her mind. How did I not know? Why didn't he tell me what else has he edited? But Victoria was too professional for that, too precise. She would process this privately, examine the implications on her own time, and then decide what it meant for her, for Daniel, for the carefully curated story she had been told about the family she was marrying into. Silence did the work more cleanly than explanation ever could. When the meeting ended on time, chairs shifted and devices were closed with the quiet efficiency of people who understood what had just happened without needing it named. Victoria lingered for a moment. Her team was already gathering their materials, making small talk with my associates about next steps and scheduling. She stood by her chair, not moving toward the door. Our eyes met briefly. At that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not hostility, not embarrassment, something closer to reassessment. She was looking at me the way she probably looked at any asset she had initially undervalued, with new attention, with the recognition that her initial analysis had been flawed. She gave me a small nod, professional, acknowledging. Then she turned and followed her team out. I gathered my papers and left the room the way I always did, without ceremony, without a glance back. I walked past my assistant's desk, past the open floor where my team was working, past the glass walls that looked out over the city I had built my empire within. I didn't feel triumph or relief. There was only the steady sense of alignment that comes when a system functions exactly as designed. I made it to my office before I allowed myself to stop. I closed the door behind me. I stood with my back against it for a moment. The skyline stretched out beyond my window, morning light now fully bright, reflecting off 1,000 glass surfaces. And then something unexpected happened. My hands were shaking. I looked down at them, surprised. I hadn't noticed during the meeting. I hadn't felt it while I was presenting, while I was answering questions, while I was performing the role I had spent years perfecting. But now, alone with no one to watch and no agenda to follow, my body was telling me something my mind hadn't acknowledged. I walked to my desk and sat down heavily. The chair was expensive, ergonomic, designed for long hours of work. I had sat in it 1,000 times, but right now it felt like the only thing holding me up. Something loosened in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Not quite satisfied, not quite vindication. Something closer to release. For years I had imagined moments like this, not this specific moment, but some version of it. The fantasy of being seen by the people who had dismissed me. The dream of watching their faces when they realized how wrong they had been. But fantasies are clean. They come with swelling music and perfect lighting and the certainty of righteousness. This didn't feel clean. It felt complicated. It felt like standing at the edge of something that couldn't be taken back. I thought about Victoria's face when she looked at that Forbes cover. I thought about the questions that were probably forming in her mind right now as her car took her back to her office. I thought about the conversation she might have with Daniel tonight or tomorrow or whenever she decided she was ready. I hadn't planned this. That felt important to remember. I hadn't orchestrated a confrontation or engineered a reveal. I had simply shown up to a meeting that had been on my calendar for months and done my job and let the truth exist in the room without apology. But the consequences of that truth were already in motion. Victoria would ask questions. Daniel would have to answer them. And the story he had told, the careful narrative where I was ordinary and irrelevant and not worth mentioning, would collapse under the weight of its own omissions. I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me, a small and petty part that I wasn't proud of, felt something like satisfaction. Let him explain. Let him stumble through the reasons why he never mentioned that his sister ran a company his fiancée's firm was trying to partner with. Let him face the consequences of his own editing. But another part of me, a quieter part, felt something closer to grief. We had been children together once, before the roles were calculated, before I became the inconvenience and he became the star. There were photographs somewhere buried in albums no one looked at anymore of the two of us building sandcastles, sharing Halloween candy, sleeping in a fort made of couch cushions. When had he decided I wasn't worth knowing? When did I become someone to manage rather than someone to include? I didn't have answers. Maybe I never would. I let myself sit with that for a moment. The grief and the satisfaction and the strange hollow feeling of a door closing behind me. Then I straightened my shoulders, pulled my keyboard closer. I opened my email. The meeting had generated action items. There were contracts to review, timelines to confirm decisions that needed my attention. The work continued whether I was ready or not. For years I had wondered what it would feel like to be seen without having to explain. Now I know. It felt like standing still while the world corrected itself around me. It also felt lonely. That was the part no one tells you about. When you stop performing for people who refuse to see you, you're left standing in your own truth with no one to share it with. I thought briefly about the distance between what is said and what is placed in front of someone at the right moment. I hadn't asked her who she thought I was. I hadn't needed to. The questions that mattered had already begun forming somewhere else, and they no longer required my participation. Outside my window, the city continued its ordinary rhythm. Traffic moved, people walked, money flowed through systems I had helped build. None of it cared about family dynamics or old wounds or the complicated aftermath of being seen. I turned back to my work. The emails waited. The decisions waited. Everything else would unfold in its own time, whether I watched or not. The day after the meeting felt ordinary in all the ways that mattered. I arrived, reviewed what had come in overnight, returned messages that required my response, and ignored the ones that didn't. No one on my team behaved differently. There were no curious looks, no attempts to read between lines that hadn't been written. But the emails from outside carried a subtle shift. Follow-ups arrived with longer subject lines, more careful phrasing. Where there had once been confident assumptions, there was now precision. One expected courtesy message never came at all. It wasn't dramatic enough to name, just different enough to notice. The order of things hadn't been announced as changed, but it had adjusted itself quietly the way social weather does before anyone looks up. I became aware of the questions before I ever heard them. They didn't come to me directly. Instead, they traveled sideways, routed through assistants' legal teams and mutual contacts who framed their inquiries as procedural. Clarifications about roles, confirmations about scope checks that should have been unnecessary. My name appeared in exchanges I wasn't copied on referenced as a fixed point rather than a variable. I didn't intervene, I didn't correct the flow. Information moved around me because it didn't require my narration. There's a particular kind of authority that comes from not needing to answer questions because the answers are already shaping behavior elsewhere. Victoria, meanwhile, didn't rush to confront anyone. She returned to her office and did what competent people do when a story no longer fits. She audited it. Files were reopened, timelines reviewed, articles reread without the framing she'd been given. She noticed patterns she hadn't questioned before, points where my involvement had been essential yet unannounced. The absence of my name in certain introductions stood out now that she knew where to look. She didn't delude herself. She simply recognized omission. The difference mattered. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It fractures along the edges where explanations thin. Daniel felt the shift before he understood it. Responses came back slower. Details he expected to be shared weren't volunteered. Conversations he was used to leading required more effort to sustain. He filled the silence with familiar explanations, rehearsed narratives delivered with confidence. This time, they didn't land the way they used to. No one contradicted him. No one confirmed him either. He adjusted his tone, added qualifiers, and tried to get ahead of questions that hadn't yet been asked. It was the sound of someone narrating into a room that no longer needed narration. When Victoria finally spoke to him, it wasn't an interrogation. Her questions were light, almost casual, designed to clarify rather than accuse. She asked about timelines, about who had been involved when decisions were made. He answered smoothly, rounding edges, leaving gaps where details would complicate the picture. My name didn't come up, but the absence was palpable, a missing variable in an otherwise complete equation. The conversation ended without resolution, and that unsettled him more than confrontation would have. Stories that can't withstand gentle inquiry aren't broken, they're exposed. The uncertainty spread outward in small, manageable waves. My parents sensed it in the way conversations stalled in the cautious tone Daniel adopted when logistics were discussed. They asked him questions framed as concern rather than challenge. Is everything okay? Did something change? He reassured them with practiced ease, but the reassurance lacked its usual confidence. No one called me. No one asked for my perspective. I remained outside the loop, and for the first time that exclusion insulated me instead of isolating me. While they recalibrated, I stayed where I was, untouched by the need to explain. I was aware that something was moving without me, and I chose not to step into it. I didn't offer clarification or context. I didn't reach out to smooth anything over. That restraint wasn't passive. It was deliberate. There's a difference between withholding and refusing, and I knew exactly which line I was holding. My schedule didn't change. My boundaries didn't blur. The story unfolding around my absence wasn't mine to manage. Power doesn't always announce itself through action. Sometimes it's exercised by declining participation altogether. Late that afternoon, Daniel received an email that didn't include an explanation, just a request. He read it twice before setting his phone down. Whatever it contained, it required more thought than his usual replies. For the first time, the narrative he'd been controlling was being rewritten somewhere he couldn't see. He had believed authority lived in the telling. He hadn't accounted for what happens when the right information is placed in the right context and allowed to speak for itself. For a few days, nothing happened, and that quiet felt like progress. No calls, no follow-ups disguised as concern, no sudden requests framed as favors. I moved through my routine with the sense that distance was finally doing what it was supposed to do, smoothing edges without anyone having to acknowledge they were sharp. It wasn't relief so much as a familiar pause, the kind that suggests a system correcting itself. I told myself this was what adjustment looked like. People recalibrated, stories settled. Maybe this time, the absence would hold. The contact didn't come from my brother. It didn't come from Victoria either. It arrived mid-afternoon, ordinary, in format almost apologetic in tone. A call first missed because I was in a meeting, then a message asking when I might be free. The name on the screen made me pause. Mom. Not a group text, not a forwarded message from the family chat, a direct call followed by a personal message. That alone was unusual enough to notice. When I returned the call later, there was no tension in the voice on the other end. Only familiarity, and with it the expectation that familiarity would be enough. "I'm glad you called back," she said. "I know you're busy." The words were warm. The tone was careful. I recognized the combination immediately. This was the voice she used when she needed something to go smoothly, when she was managing a situation rather than having a conversation. "What's going on?" I asked. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she talked around it. How was work? Had I been sleeping enough? Was I eating properly? The questions were reflexive, the kind mothers ask when they don't know how to begin. I waited. The conversation shifted gradually. No accusations, no raised voices, just context. I was told that things were complicated, that emotions were running high, that timing mattered. Victoria had mentioned something to Daniel after their meeting. There had been tension. Questions had been asked that Daniel wasn't prepared to answer. The gala was still being discussed in certain circles, and now there were whispers about the business connection that no one had anticipated. "It's awkward for everyone," my mother said. "You have to understand that." I was reminded gently that my brother was under pressure, that the engagement was important, that reputations were fragile, that misunderstandings could spiral if left unattended. "Victoria is confused," my mother continued. "She's asking Daniel why he never mentioned all of this, your company, the Forbes article. She feels like she walked into something unprepared." I noticed my mother didn't say Victoria felt lied to. She said Victoria felt unprepared. The word choice was careful, designed to distribute the discomfort evenly, to make it sound like a miscommunication, rather than a deliberate omission. "I don't know what you want me to do about that," I said. "Well," a pause. "It would help if you could clarify a few things, just to help people understand. Maybe reach out to Victoria directly. Explain that it was never intentional, that family and business are separate, that Daniel didn't mean to what?" Another pause, longer this time. "He's your brother," she said finally. "Whatever happened between you, whatever misunderstanding there was about the gala that's separate, this is about keeping things from getting worse." The words were chosen to sound reasonable, to make the request feel like a shared responsibility rather than an imposition. I listened without interrupting, recognizing the structure before the content fully landed. Then the request came into sharper focus. Could I smooth the situation by reaching out to Victoria? Could I frame the whole thing as an innocent oversight? Could I stay quiet publicly, at least for now, so things wouldn't escalate? Could I help manage this in a way that protects Daniel's relationship and the family's reputation? It wasn't framed as lying. It was framed as patience, as maturity, as being the bigger person, as what family does for each other. "I know you two have had your differences," my mother said, "but he's about to get married. This is a big moment for him, for all of us. I'm asking you to think about the bigger picture." The implication was clear, even if the language avoided it. I was being asked to shrink again, to absorb the weight so the structure wouldn't have to adjust, to perform the role of the understanding sister who didn't hold grudges, who prioritized family harmony over personal truth. What struck me wasn't the unfairness of it. It was the familiarity. This wasn't new behavior. It was a refined version of something I'd seen my entire life. My mother wasn't being malicious. She was being exactly who she had always been, the peacekeeper. The one who smoothed edges and managed feelings and made sure everyone stayed comfortable enough to keep showing up. She had done it when Daniel got the bigger bedroom because he was older. She had done it when my achievements went unmentioned at family dinners because it might make him feel competitive. She had done it when I was excluded from events because my presence complicated the image he wanted to project. She had always chosen the path that required the least adjustment from everyone except me. I wasn't angry at her for it. That was the strange part. I understood her completely. She had built her life around maintaining equilibrium, and I was the variable that threatened it. From her perspective, this request made perfect sense. I was the one with less at stake, the one with less to lose, the one who had always been willing to step back. She didn't want the truth. She wanted containment. She wanted the consequences managed without addressing the cause. "Mom," I said, "did Daniel ever tell you what he said to me before the gala?" Silence on the other end. "Did he tell you he called me ordinary, that he said I didn't belong in their world, that I would make the family look bad?" More silence, then quietly, "I'm sure he didn't mean it that way." "How did he mean it?" "He was nervous. The gala was important. Victoria's family was going to be there. He just wanted everything to go perfectly." "So he told me not to come." She trailed off. I heard her swallow. "He shouldn't have said it that way, but you know how he gets when he's stressed. He doesn't think before he speaks." I closed my eyes. There it was, the familiar reflex, the automatic excuse. "He doesn't mean it. He's stressed. You know how he is." In that moment, something settled with a clarity I hadn't felt before. I understood my place in their system precisely. I wasn't chosen. I was deployed. My mother didn't call because she wanted to understand what happened. She didn't call because she was concerned about me. She called because the system was malfunctioning, and she needed me to help fix it the same way I had always helped fix it. By being quiet, by being understanding, by asking for less. I realized then that neutrality had always been conditional. The peacekeeper only existed as long as the system remained intact. When pressure mounted, neutrality tipped toward preservation, not fairness. And preservation always meant protecting the person with the most social capital. The request wasn't about me. It was about maintaining a version of events that kept everyone else from having to reevaluate their assumptions. I wasn't being asked to speak or stay silent for my own sake. I was being asked to perform stability, the same role I'd been offered my entire life. "I'm not going to reach out to Victoria," I said. My mother started to respond, but I continued. "I didn't create this situation. Daniel did. He chose to tell his fiancée a version of our family that erased me from it. He chose to exclude me from the gala and tell everyone I didn't belong. And now that his choices are creating consequences, he didn't anticipate your calling me to fix it." "That's not—" "It is." My voice was calm. I wasn't angry. I was just clear. "You're asking me to protect him from the results of his own decisions, and I'm not going to do that." There was a pause after that, the kind that follows an unexpected answer, where the speaker recalculates their next move. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult about this," my mother said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but underneath it was something harder. Frustration. The sound of someone encountering resistance they hadn't prepared for. "I'm not being difficult. I'm just not participating." "Participating in what?" "In the story where I'm the one who has to fix things. In the version where Daniel's behavior doesn't have consequences because I absorb them for him. I've been participating in that story for 35 years. I'm done!" She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, she sounded confused. Genuinely confused, like I had started speaking a language she didn't recognize. "I don't know what you want me to say." "You don't have to say anything. I'm just telling you that I won't be reaching out to Victoria. I won't be explaining away what Daniel did. Whatever happens between them is for them to work out. And if it damages the engagement, then that's the consequence of the story he told." The disappointment in her voice was heavy, not angry. Disappointment carries a different weight. It assumes expectation. It assumes that you owe something that you're failing to deliver. "I thought you were bigger than this," she said quietly. That sentence landed somewhere deep, not because it was fair, but because it was familiar. I had heard versions of it my whole life. Be the bigger person. Don't make waves. Family is more important than being right. But I knew something now that I hadn't known before. Being bigger always meant being smaller. It meant taking up less space so others could take up more. It meant accepting less so others wouldn't have to give anything up. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone," I said. "I'm just not willing to hurt myself to prevent discomfort that I didn't cause." The call ended politely, with reassurances that she understood, even though it was clear she didn't. When the line went quiet, I felt the shift immediately. Something had closed. Not slammed shut, but sealed. The relationship hadn't ended. It had changed categories. Whatever access I'd had to that middle ground was gone. I sat with that realization longer than I expected to. The apartment was quiet around me. Evening light slanted through the windows, turning everything golden and soft. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference. Traffic and voices and the distant sound of sirens. Life continued unconcerned with what had just shifted inside this room. And for the first time, I let myself feel what I'd been holding back. It hurt, more than I wanted to admit. This was my mother, the woman who had taught me to read, who had held my hand on the first day of kindergarten, who had stayed up late helping me with science projects and college applications. The woman who had, in her own way, loved me as best as she knew how. And she had chosen comfort over fairness, just like everyone else. I felt the sting of it settle somewhere deep in a place I hadn't let anyone reach in a long time. The place where I still kept the hope that someday someone in my family would see me without needing to be shown, would choose me without needing to be asked. That hope had been quieter than I realized, buried under years of adjustment and lowered expectations and the practiced indifference I wore like armor. But it had been there small and stubborn, waiting for evidence that it was worth keeping. Now it was dissolving, and the space it left behind felt vast and unfamiliar. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the light to change, for the gold to fade into blue, for the apartment to grow dim around me. My mother's voice echoed in my head. "I thought you were bigger than this." And I wanted to call her back and say, "I am bigger than this." That's exactly the problem. I've been bigger than this my whole life. Bigger than every slight I swallowed, every achievement I downplayed, every time I stepped back so Daniel could step forward. I have been so big that I became invisible. I have been so accommodating that everyone forgot I had needs of my own. I didn't call her back. Some things can't be explained to people who have already decided not to understand. But beneath the hurt, something else emerged. Something quieter and more solid. The last illusion I'd held about my place in the family dissolved. I had believed that if I stayed reasonable, if I remained patient, someone would eventually choose fairness over convenience. Someone would see the pattern and name, it would stand up and say, "This isn't right, she deserves better." That belief had been a comfort. A small flame I carried without examining too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting how unlikely it was to ever be true. Letting it go hurt. But it also felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I had been waiting for permission that was never coming, for acknowledgement from people who had built their comfort on my silence. For a seat at a table I didn't even want to sit at anymore. I didn't need their permission. The consequences followed quickly, though subtly. Over the next few days, communication cooled. My mother's texts became shorter, more formal. The easy updates about weather and recipes and neighborhood gossip stopped. The family group chat continued without me, and I noticed I was no longer included in the small decisions that used to come my way. Restaurant choices, holiday logistics, the tiny threads that weave families together. I wasn't punished. I was reclassified. The door hadn't been slammed in my face. It had simply been closed gently, with an understanding that I wouldn't be knocking again. That night alone, I didn't feel lighter or heavier. I felt precise. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I knew exactly where I stood. The ambiguity was gone. The waiting was over. The hope that had kept me attached to a system that didn't serve me had finally released its grip. Betrayal, I learned, doesn't always come from those who oppose you. Sometimes it comes from those who want everything to stay exactly as it is. From the people who would rather you disappear quietly than ask them to change. I had spent years believing that harm required intent. Now I understand that preservation could be just as damaging. The instinct to keep things smooth, to avoid conflict, to maintain the comfortable lie, that instinct could wound just as deeply as cruelty. Maybe more because it came wrapped in the language of love and family and doing what's best. The people who fear disruption will always ask the same thing of you: to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than the truth requires. They will frame it as maturity. They will call it keeping the peace. They will tell you that you're being difficult, that you're overreacting, that you're making things harder than they need to be, and they will believe it. That's the hardest part. They will genuinely believe they are asking for something reasonable because they have never had to pay the price of their own comfort. This time I didn't say okay. I said no, and the world didn't end. It just got quieter, clearer, more mine. The days after that call were quiet in a way that felt final. Not tense, not waiting, not heavy with unfinished conversations. Just closed. I didn't follow up. I didn't replay the words to see if I'd missed a softer answer. I understood with a kind of hard-earned certainty that something had ended exactly where it was supposed to. This silence wasn't the kind that asked to be filled. It wasn't a pause before reconciliation. It was the absence that comes when expectation finally dies, and with it the obligation to manage anyone else's comfort. My routines didn't change. I worked. I answered messages that mattered. I ignored the ones that didn't. What did change was internal and subtle. I stopped bracing. I wasn't listening for the undertone in every interaction, the hidden request that I might be asked to smooth something over again. That vigilance had been a habit, not a choice. Without it, my days felt strangely efficient, like a system no longer running unnecessary background processes. The support came from someone I'd worked with for nearly a decade. Rachel had been my first real hire back when the company was just me and a rented desk in a co-working space. She had watched me build everything from the ground up, had been there for the 18-hour days and the contracts that fell through and the ones that changed everything. We'd built things together, navigated risk-made decisions that carried consequences. Trust between us wasn't emotional. It was operational. She knew my patterns better than anyone could read my silences the way most people read words. When she knocked on my office door that Thursday afternoon, I knew immediately it wasn't about work. "Got a minute?" she asked. I nodded, and she closed the door behind her. That alone was unusual. Rachel preferred open doors, quick conversations, efficiency over ceremony. She sat down across from my desk, the same chair where clients sat during negotiations, but she didn't carry herself like a client. She carried herself like someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say something. "I've noticed some things," she said. No preamble, no small talk. That was Rachel. She didn't reference my brother. She didn't mention Victoria. She didn't ask for context. Instead, she told me what she'd observed in the past week. How certain conversations in our industry were being framed differently now. How my name was being handled carefully in circles where it used to be mentioned casually, as if it suddenly carried weight people weren't sure how to address. "The Peterson account," she said. "Their CFO called yesterday, asked specifically to speak with you about extending the contract, not the account manager. You." I hadn't heard about that call yet. "And the conference next month in Boston. The organizers reached out. They want you for a keynote panel, specifically requested. Said they'd seen some recent coverage and thought you'd be a strong addition." "What recent coverage?" Rachel's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to it. "Victoria's firm has been talking, not publicly, but in the places where people talk, about the partnership meeting, about who they discovered they'd been negotiating with." She paused. Word travels fast when people realize they've underestimated someone. I sat with that for a moment. The information wasn't surprising exactly, but hearing it stated so plainly by someone who had no stake in flattering me made it land differently. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "Because I've worked for you for 9 years, and I've watched you carry weight that wasn't yours to carry. I've seen you shrink yourself in conversations where you should have taken up more space. I've watched you apologize for things that didn't require apologies." She wasn't being sentimental. Her voice was the same one she used in strategy meetings, direct and analytical. And now I'm watching something shift. The outside world is catching up to what I've known for years. I just wanted you to know that you don't need to step in and manage this. You don't need to clarify anything on anyone else's behalf. Systems correct themselves when allowed to, and interference usually only delays that process. I didn't argue. I didn't thank her effusively. I nodded, because it was the first time someone had articulated exactly what I'd already decided, without needing me to defend it. For once, I wasn't being evaluated on my ability to explain my boundaries. "There's one more thing," Rachel said. She pulled out her phone, scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward me. It was an email chain. I recognized some of the names industry contacts, people whose opinions carried weight in financial technology circles. The thread was discussing our company, our recent growth, and the value of what we'd built. My name appeared multiple times, each mention more substantial than the last. At the bottom of the thread, one message stood out. It was from the managing director of a firm we'd been trying to connect with for years. He had written, "I had dinner with Victoria Hale last week. She mentioned the partnership meeting, said she'd never been more impressed by a founder's command of their own technology. We should schedule a call." Rachel put her phone away. "I'm not showing you this to inflate your ego. I'm showing you because I want you to understand that what's happening right now isn't an accident. It's a correction. The world is adjusting to information that was always true, but wasn't visible to the right people." She stood up, straightened her jacket. "You've spent years being the person who made everyone else comfortable. I'm just here to tell you that you can stop now. The work speaks for itself. It always has." She left my office without waiting for a response. That was Rachel. Say what needs to be said, then move on. The support she offered wasn't dramatic. There was no speech about loyalty or friendship. It showed up as alignment in the places that mattered. Over the next few days, I noticed the effects multiplying. A meeting was scheduled, with my name positioned clearly on the agenda, not buried at the bottom. A decision was made about a new client without anyone checking whether it would complicate anyone else's narrative. A quiet acknowledgement came from a board member who had previously directed all his questions to our head of sales instead of me. Rachel didn't say she was standing with me. She acted as if it was already assumed. The way information flowed changed. Conversations that used to happen around me now included me without comment, not as a gesture but as a correction. Industry publications that had previously profiled our company without mentioning me by name were suddenly requesting interviews. Conference invitations arrived with my name already printed in the promotional materials. The system adjusted its posture slightly, like a structure redistributing weight when a support beam proves solid. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't orchestrated it. I simply hadn't removed myself to make others comfortable. My brother heard about it secondhand. Not through me, not through family channels, through the same networks he'd always relied on to confirm his standing. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing my name in a trade publication. A colleague of his attended a dinner where my company was discussed favorably. Victoria apparently had not been shy about sharing her discovery with her professional circle, and those circles overlapped with his in ways he hadn't anticipated. The difference this time was that the information didn't come filtered through family interpretation. There was nothing he could reframe, nothing he could preempt. He couldn't decide how the story would be told because it wasn't his story anymore. For the first time, he wasn't the sole narrator in a room that mattered. I didn't see his reaction, but I didn't need to. I recognized the pattern when his messages changed tone over the following days. Shorter, less directive, more careful. He sent me a text that said nothing substantive, just checking in, hope you're doing well. The kind of message that tests whether the door is still open without committing to walking through it. I didn't respond. He didn't confront me. He didn't apologize. He tested the ground instead, feeling for leverage that wasn't there anymore. The absence of my response unsettled him more than any argument could have. Control once lost rarely returns in the same form. There was no confrontation. No meeting was arranged to clear the air. No carefully worded message sent to set the record straight. I didn't gather anyone around a table or ask for time to speak. I didn't post-announce or explain. I didn't reclaim a seat I'd been pushed out of because I never asked for it back. I kept working. I finished the things already in motion. I signed what needed signing, answered what needed answering, and let the rest pass without response. The silence that once felt like retreat had shifted. It no longer protected me. It positioned me. The first changes were small enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. An email thread where my name appeared on CC without anyone flagging it. A calendar invite that came directly to me instead of through someone else. A question forwarded to my inbox instead of being summarized by an intermediary. No one said, "We should include her." No one acknowledged a correction. It happened the way systems update quietly without ceremony once the error has been identified. I wasn't announced, I assumed. People began addressing me as if the role had always been mine. Not cautiously, not apologetically, simply correctly. They didn't reference the past or offer explanations for why things were different now. They adjusted their behavior and moved on, which told me everything I needed to know. Influence, when it's real, doesn't require consensus. It reveals itself in defaults. My brother noticed later than most. Not because he wasn't observant, but because he was used to being the reference point. The lag was subtle at first. Information arrived slower. Conversations that used to include him by default now ended before reaching him. He wasn't excluded deliberately. He was bypassed. That distinction mattered. No one had decided against him. They had simply decided without him. He didn't react outwardly, at least not in ways I could see. There were no angry calls, no accusations, just a slight recalibration in how he spoke, the way someone talks when they realize the room has shifted but can't pinpoint when. He tried to reassert rhythm, to narrate again, but the timing was off. Stories that once landed smoothly now felt unnecessary. Without the audience reinforcing them, they fell flat. Victoria adjusted differently. She had access now to information that didn't come filtered through family context or social convenience. She didn't confront me. She didn't ask for clarification. She didn't need to. The data spoke for itself. She took it in quietly and revised her internal map. Whatever she felt about it stayed hers. I respected that. She wasn't diminished by the realization. She was sharpened by it. Trust once withdrawn from the wrong place doesn't disappear. It relocates. The family sensed the shift last, not because they were unaware, but because the change didn't come from within. They heard my name used differently by people outside our orbit, with more precision, with more weight. They didn't challenge it. They didn't rush to reinterpret it. They absorbed it cautiously, the way people do when they realize the story they've been telling themselves no longer matches the one being told elsewhere. No one asked me what to do with this new information. No one asked how I felt. That too was consistent. Then the message came from my brother, not a demand, not quite a plea, something in between, framed carefully with the kind of language people use when they're not sure of their footing anymore. "We should talk. There have been some misunderstandings. I think things got complicated and I'd like to clear the air." I read it twice, noted what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of what he'd said before the gala, no curiosity about how I was doing, no recognition of the distance that had grown or any role he might have played in creating it. The timing mattered. This wasn't an attempt to reconnect because he missed me or because he'd realized something important about our relationship. It was an attempt to reestablish balance now that the outside world had recalibrated without him. The recognition came after the power shift, not before it. That distinction clarified everything. When he followed up with a phone call 2 days later, I answered. Not because I owed him anything, but because I was curious. I wanted to hear how far the narrative could go without friction. His voice was different than I remembered from the Gala call. Softer, less certain. The sharp edges had been filed down, replaced by something that almost sounded like caution. "I feel like we got off track somewhere," he said. "I don't even know how it happened, but Victoria mentioned the meeting, and I realized I didn't even know about all of that. Your company. What you've built." He paused, waiting for me to fill the silence the way I always had, to offer context, explanation, reassurance. I didn't. "I think maybe I've been out of the loop," he continued, his voice tightening slightly, "and I just want us to get back to normal. You know we're family. Whatever happened, we can move past it." Whatever happened, as if it had been the weather, as if no one had made choices. "What do you think happened?" I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't know. Things got busy. We all got caught up in our own stuff. The Gala thing was it was a stressful time. I probably didn't handle it well." Probably. I didn't handle it well. The language was so carefully vague, designed to acknowledge something without admitting anything. He wasn't apologizing. He was negotiating, trying to find the minimum concession that would restore the old order. "I'm not looking for an apology," I said. "Then what do you want?" The question hung there between us. I could hear his confusion, genuine and frustrated. In his mind, this was simple. There had been tension, and now there was an opening for resolution. All I had to do was take it. That was when the options clarified themselves. Mercy presented itself first the way it always does. It looked reasonable, kind, easy to justify. I could smooth things over, accept his half-apology as enough, let people believe that whatever tension existed had resolved itself naturally. Mercy would be praised. It would restore familiarity. It would allow everyone to move forward without discomfort. I understood the appeal. Mercy asks for nothing in the moment. It promises relief. It carries social rewards. But I also saw what it required beneath the surface. It required me to step back into a position where my value was conditional, where my presence served to stabilize others at the expense of my own clarity, where I would once again be the one who made things easy, who absorbed friction, who pretended that damage hadn't been done. Mercy in this form wasn't forgiveness. It was erasure with better language. "I don't want anything from you," I said finally. "That's the point. I don't need you to understand what happened or agree with how I see it. I'm not asking you to change or apologize or make anything right." "Then why won't you just—" "Because you're asking me to pretend that everything is fine so that you can feel better about how things are. And I'm not going to do that." Silence on his end. I could almost hear him recalculating, searching for the argument that would work the angle that would get him what he wanted. "So what, we're just not going to talk anymore?" "We can talk whenever you want. But I'm not going to perform reconciliation for the family's comfort. I'm not going to show up at events and smile like nothing happened so that everyone can pretend the story they've been telling is true. That's not what I'm asking. It is, though. You just don't see it that way." More silence. When I responded with my final thought, I kept it brief. No explanation, no emotional framing. I didn't reference the past or predict the future. "I'm not angry at you," I said. "I just don't need your version of normal anymore. I have my own." The pause that followed told me more than any argument could have. There was no immediate comeback, no attempt to reframe, just silence heavier than before because it couldn't be filled with assumptions anymore. "I don't understand you," he said finally. "I know," I said. "That's okay." I hung up first. Not dramatically, just cleanly, the way you end a conversation that has reached its natural conclusion. I sat with that quiet afterward, not feeling loss, not feeling triumph, just space, the kind that appears when a door closes cleanly instead of slamming. I realized then that power had never been about leverage or visibility. It was about not being pulled back into definitions that no longer fit, about choosing absence over misrepresentation, about allowing others to sit with the consequences of the stories they had told without my help smoothing the edges. I had thought once that power was something to be taken, defended, proven, something loud, something visible. But standing there with nothing left to resolve, I understood it differently. Power had arrived not when I demanded recognition, but when I stopped allowing others to decide who I needed to be for them. It wasn't an ending filled with resolution. It was a beginning defined by clarity. Time passed without ceremony, weeks folded into each other, then months, and nothing dramatic rushed in to fill the space. No urgent calls, no explanations offered on my behalf, no requests disguised as concern. The quiet settled into something steady, not the fragile kind that waits to be broken, but the kind that holds. I noticed it most in the mornings when the day began without anyone else's expectations attached to it, and in the evenings when there was nothing left unresolved that needed my attention. Silence for once wasn't avoidance. It was equilibrium. The world continued exactly as it always does, indifferent to who feels vindicated and who feels exposed. Events still happened, schedules filled, people adjusted without announcing that they were adjusting. My brother remained visible present in the places he had always occupied, but something subtle had shifted. He was no longer the axis. Conversations didn't orbit him the same way. He wasn't deferred to automatically. Nothing had been taken from him. He simply wasn't given what he once assumed would always be his. I heard through distant channels that the wedding was still happening. Spring somewhere upstate, the kind of venue that photographs well. I wasn't invited, and I didn't expect to be. The absence of an invitation wasn't a slight anymore. It was just information, a confirmation of boundaries that had already been drawn. Victoria and I never spoke again after that meeting. I saw her name occasionally in industry publications, always professional, always precise. She had built her career on accuracy, and I suspected she had quietly revised a number of assumptions after that day in my conference room. Not just about me, but about the reliability of information that came filtered through people who had reasons to edit it. I respected the distance she kept. Some realizations don't require conversation. They change behavior quietly, then move on. At family gatherings I no longer attended, I was told the tone had softened. Not warmer, just quieter. The gala stopped being referenced, then stopped existing altogether in conversation, as if it had been a weather event rather than a decision. My mother called once a few months after everything settled. The conversation was short, carefully neutral. She asked about work. I gave her the version that fit in a sentence or two. She didn't ask follow-up questions, and I didn't offer details. Before she hung up, she said, "I hope you know we're proud of you." I didn't know how to respond to that. The words arrived too late and too vague to land the way she probably intended. Pride that comes after public recognition isn't the same as pride that exists in private, steady, and unconditional. But I thanked her anyway. Not because I believed her, but because it cost me nothing, and fighting about it would have cost us both more than either of us wanted to spend. As for me, I didn't become someone new. There was no reinvention montage, no decisive pivot that could be summarized neatly. I just stopped doing certain things. I stopped asking permission to take up space. I stopped explaining choices that didn't need approval. I stopped adjusting my tone to make other people comfortable with my clarity. It wasn't an addition of confidence so much as a subtraction of habits that had never served me. Rachel noticed the change before I did. "You're different in meetings now," she told me one afternoon after a call with a difficult client. "Different how? You don't apologize before you disagree anymore. You just disagree." I hadn't realized I used to do that. But she was right. There had been a time when every contradiction came wrapped in softening language. "I think maybe," or "I could be wrong, but," or "sorry, just to clarify." Phrases designed to make my competence palatable, to reassure everyone that I wasn't a threat, even when I was correcting them. I didn't do that anymore. The company continued to grow. The partnership with Victoria's firm went through, eventually handled by lawyers and account managers who had no stake in family dynamics. It was a good deal for both sides. Business, it turns out, doesn't care about personal history. It only cares about value. I chose where to show up and where not to. I accepted roles that came with responsibility instead of performance. I spent time with people who didn't need context to respect me. The change was visible mostly in what I declined. Invitations that required me to compress myself went unanswered. Conversations that depended on me being agreeable lost momentum when I didn't supply it. Nothing burned, nothing exploded. Things simply reorganized around the absence of my compliance. One evening late, I sat alone in my office after everyone else had gone home. The city glittered outside my window, millions of lights in millions of windows, millions of people living stories I would never know. I thought about the woman I had been a year ago, the one who said okay to her brother's dismissal and meant something entirely different by it than he understood. The one who had built an empire in silence because noise had never been rewarded. I wasn't angry at her. She had done what she needed to do to survive a system that wasn't designed to see her. She had played the long game without even knowing she was playing it, building something real, while everyone around her was distracted by performance. But I wasn't her anymore either. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't require return. You can let go without stepping back into the place that hurt you. You can acknowledge effort without reopening access. Boundaries don't have to be loud to be firm. I held mine without explanation, and the world adjusted accordingly. What surprised me most wasn't how others changed, but how little I needed that change to feel complete. There was a time when recognition felt like oxygen, when being understood by the people closest to me seemed essential. I don't think that need was a weakness. It was human. But it was also conditional, dependent on a system that only valued me when I fit its story. The real shift came when no one else controlled the narrative about who I was, when their version of me lost relevance because it no longer intersected with my life. The moment I said okay back then wasn't surrender. It was the point at which the game ended. Everything after that was just the system catching up. I know now that being called ordinary was never an assessment. It was a request to remain manageable, predictable, convenient, a request to stay small so others could feel large. Refusing that request didn't require confrontation. It required distance. Distance gave clarity. Clarity removed leverage. And without leverage, the story lost its power. The quietest revenge is becoming unreachable to the version of yourself they tried to keep small. Not because you're hiding, but because you've moved beyond the range of their expectations. You don't argue, you don't correct, you don't demand acknowledgement. You simply stop being available for misdefinition. I turned off my office light and gathered my things. The elevator was empty at this hour, the lobby quiet except for the security guard who nodded as I passed. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. I walked toward home without hurrying, just another person in a city full of people carrying stories no one else could see. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting either. The space where those feelings used to live was now occupied by something steadier. A sense of direction that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. A life that doesn't need defending. Somewhere out there, my brother was planning a wedding I wouldn't attend. My parents were adjusting to a new configuration of family that didn't include me at the center of their concerns. Victoria was building her career on foundations that had shifted slightly invisibly after one meeting in a conference room. And I was here. Walking home through a city I had helped build in ways most people would never see or understand. That was enough. It had always been enough. I just hadn't known it yet.